Treasures of the Snow, Chapter 2. That was how Daniel Bernier, aged 3 hours, became the special property of Annette Bernier, aged 7 years. The kind village nurse stayed for some time to bath and feed him. When she left, Annette's father paid a woman from the village to come and nurse him, but he belonged to Annette, and nobody ever spoke of him as anything but Annette's baby. For, once the great shock of her grief was over, Annette gathered up all the love of her sorrowful, lonely little heart and poured it out on her little brother. She held his bottle while he sucked, and sat quietly by his cradle in case he should wake and want her. It was Annette who ran to him in the night if he woke or whimpered. It was she who carried him out onto the balcony at midday so that the sun might shine on him. And in this atmosphere of love and sunshine, the baby thrived. There was no other baby of his age in the valley to touch him for strength and beauty. He slept and woke and chuckled and fed and kicked and slept again. In fact, he never gave a moment's anxiety to anyone. "He was born under a lucky star," exclaimed the woman from the village, gazing at him thoughtfully. "He was born under a Christmas star," said Annette solemnly. "I think he will always be good and happy." And how he grew! By the time the sun was beginning to melt the snows and the crocuses were pushing up in the pale fields, he was easily outgrowing his baby clothes. And as soon as the cows had gone up the mountain, he cut his first tooth. As Annette knew nothing about first teeth, and expected no trouble, it seemed that the baby himself forgot that it should have been a troublesome affair. So instead of fretting and crying, he merely giggled and sucked his fists. By the time the beech leaves were flaming like golden torches among the dark pines, and the first blizzards began to blow over the mountains, Danny was moving around, and his cradle could contain him no longer. He wanted to explore everything from the stove to the balcony steps. Annette spent an anxious few weeks hauling him out of danger. In the end, she decided she could bear the strain no longer. So they tied him by one pink foot to the leg of the kitchen table, and he explored in circles. Life became more peaceful. One evening, Annette, slipping down to the living room after tucking Danny up in his cradle, found her father sitting by the stove with his head in his hands. He looked old and tired and grey. He had often looked old and tired since his wife died, but tonight he looked worse than usual. Annette, who tried hard to make up for her mother, laid her soft cheek against his bony one. "What is the matter, Papa?" she asked. "Are you very tired tonight? Shall I heat you a cup of coffee?" He looked down at her curiously for a moment or two. She was so small and light, like some golden-haired fairy, but how sensible and womanly she was. Somehow during the past year, he had made a habit of telling her his troubles. He had even listened to her serious advice. So now he drew her head against his shoulder and told her all about it. "We shall have to sell some of the cows, little daughter," he explained sadly. "We must have some more money, or there will be no winter boots for you." Annette raised her head and stared at him in horror. They only had 10 cows, and each one was a personal friend. Any one of them would be missed terribly. She must think of a better way to earn money than that. "You see," went on her father, "other men have wives to look after their little ones. I have to pay a woman to nurse Danny, and it doesn't come cheap. Yet someone must look after him, poor little boy." Now Annette sat up very straight and tossed back her plaits. She saw her way quite clearly. All she had to do was to make her father see it too. "Papa," she said very slowly, "you do not need Mademoiselle Mottier any longer. I am 8.5 now, and I can look after Danny as well as anyone. You will not have to pay me anything, and then we can keep the cows. Why think, Papa, how unhappy they would be to leave us. I do believe Paquerette would cry." "But you must go to school," said her father rather doubtfully. It would not be right to keep you at home. Anyhow, it is against the law. The master would want to know why, and he would tell the mayor, and we should get into trouble." "But it is much more important to look after Danny," answered Annette, wrinkling her forehead. "And if you explained to the master, he would understand. He is kind, the master, and he is a friend of yours. Let us try it and see what happens. I will do my lessons here in the kitchen, Papa, every morning. Danny can play on the floor. And in any case, when he is 5, he will go to the infant school." Her father continued to look at her thoughtfully. Small as she was, he thought she was as clever as a woman in looking after the baby. Also, he knew she was marvellously handy about the house. But she could not do the cooking or knit the stockings or do the rough heavy work, and besides, she ought to have some schooling. He sat thinking in silence for a full 5 minutes, and then he had an idea. "I wonder if your grandmother would come," he said suddenly. "She is old and has rheumatics, and her sight is poor, but she could do the cooking and mending, perhaps, and she could help you with your lessons in the evenings. It would be company for you, too, when I am up the mountain. You're too little a girl to be left alone all day long. If I write a letter to the master telling him that grandmother will give you a bit of teaching, maybe he will agree to keep quiet about it." Annette fetched 2 sheets of paper and the pen and ink from the cupboard. "Write them both now," she said, "and I will post the letters when I go for the bread. Then we shall get the answers nice and quickly." Both letters were answered that week. The first answer was in the shape of grandmother. She arrived by train, all bent over, with a wooden box roped up very securely. Annette went down to meet her, and watched the little electric train caterpillaring its way up the valley between the hayfields. It was late, the man at the wheel explained angrily, because a cow had strayed onto the line and the train had had to stop. He was so eager to move on quickly that grandmother barely had time to get down from the train before it set off again. Her wooden box had to be hurled out after her while the train was moving. Grandmother, however, seemed quite unmoved. She leaned on her stick and wanted to know how she was to get up the hill. Annette, who knew nothing about rheumatism, suggested that they should walk. Grandmother said, "Nonsense, child." In the end, they got a lift in an empty farm cart that had brought cheeses down to the train and was now going back up the mountain. The road was stony, the wheels wooden, and the mules stumbled a lot. Annette enjoyed the ride very much more than grandmother did, but the old woman gritted her teeth and made no complaint. She only let out a tired sigh of relief when she found herself safely on the sofa by the stove. She had a cushion at her aching back, and Annette bustled about getting her some tea. Danny came out from under the table, shuffling along on his backside. He stuck 3 fingers in his mouth and laughed at grandmother. She put on her spectacles to see him better. They sat for some moments staring at each other, her dim old eyes meeting his forget-me-not blue ones. Then he threw back his head and laughed again. "That child will wear out his trouser seat," said grandmother, taking a piece of bread and butter and cherry jam. "He should be taught to crawl." She said no more until she had finished her tea. Then she flicked the crumbs from her black skirt and rose, leaning heavily on her stick. "So," she remarked, "I have come. What I can, I will do. What I cannot, you must do for me. Now, Annette, turn that baby the right way up and come and show me round the kitchen." From that moment grandmother did what she could, Annette did the rest, and the household ran like clockwork. All except for Danny, who continued to move round and round the table leg on his seat, in spite of grandmother. So, after a few days, Annette was sent to the village to buy some thick black felt, and grandmother sewed round patches onto the seats of all Danny's knickerbockers. He looked a little odd in them, but they served their purpose very well indeed. After all, They weren't seen much because they were nearly always underneath him. The second answer arrived in the shape of the village schoolmaster. He came up from the valley late on Saturday afternoon to call on Monsieur Bernier. Annette's father was milking cows and saw him coming out of the cowshed window. He did not want to argue with the schoolmaster because he was afraid of getting the worst of it, so he ran out the back door and hid in the hayloft. Annette, who was also looking out of the living-room window, saw her father's legs disappear up the ladder just as the schoolmaster came round the corner. She understood perfectly what was expected of her. She opened the door and invited the master in, offering him most politely the best chair with a red plush seat. He was very fond of Annette, and Annette was very fond of him, but today they were a little bit shy of each other. Grandmother folded her hands and sat up straight. Her expression reminded Annette of a picture she had seen of an old war-horse scenting battle. "Annette, I have come to see your father," began the schoolmaster, coughing nervously, "to discuss his letter about your being absent from school. I cannot say that I think it right for a little girl of your age. Besides, it is against the law of the state." "The state will know nothing about Annette unless you choose to mention her," said grandmother shortly. "Besides, I will educate the child myself. I do not think it right for a little boy of Daniel's age to be left without his sister to look after him." But can't you look after him?" suggested the schoolmaster gently. "Certainly not," snapped grandmother. "My sight is so poor that I cannot see where he is going. My arms are so rheumaticky that I cannot pick him up if he falls. Besides, he moves like an express train, and I am nearly 80. Do you not know what you are talking about?" The schoolmaster gazed at Danny, who was playing on the floor. There was nothing much to be seen of him but the black felt patch and his dimpled legs. The schoolmaster frowned. "When will your father be in, Annette?" he asked. I do not know. He may not be back for some time." "It is not worth your while to wait, monsieur," replied Annette steadily. She knew perfectly well that her father would return just as soon as the master's hat disappeared down the valley. The schoolmaster sat thinking. He was a good man and really cared about Annette and his duty towards her. Yet he did not want to give up her father, his old friend, into the hands of the law. He could see that the child was needed at home. At last he had an idea. He did not think that it was a very good one, but it was better than nothing. He turned to grandmother. "I will let the matter rest on one condition only, that is, that every Saturday morning when Annette comes down for the bread, she shall visit me in my house. I will give her some tests to see if she is making progress in her studies at home. I will say no more, but if I find she is learning nothing, then I shall feel it my duty to insist that she attend school like the other children." He tried to speak sternly, but Annette beamed at him. Danny, sensing a family victory, suddenly turned himself the right way up and laughed. The schoolmaster looked at the two fair, motherless children for a moment, smiled, and took his leave. As soon as he had disappeared into the pine wood, Annette ran to the door and called to her father to come down from the hayloft. So, every Saturday morning, Annette rapped at the front door of the tall white house where the schoolmaster lived, with her bread basket on her back and her tattered exercise book in her hand. In the winter they sat by the stove and ate spiced fruit tart made by the schoolmaster's friendly housekeeper and drank hot chocolate. In the summer they sat on the veranda and ate cherries and drank apple juice. After that the tests would begin. They always started with arithmetic, but Annette was no good at arithmetic and struggled with her answers.